Hello everyone, this is Dr. Matt Westbrook, and this is the Red Pill Show. I'm inviting you today to join me on a journey as we red pill on the Palestinian-Israeli issue. Today's episode is going to deconstruct a myth. Myth number one, which is that the whole conflict is about Israeli Jews against Palestinian Arabs. To start our show today, I want to give you some basic facts about Israel. Israel's size is approximately the size of New Jersey, believe it or not. It's a really tiny country. And squished into this landmass are about 8.5 million citizens of Israel. 6.5 million of them are Israeli Jews. About 1.8 million of them are Israeli Arabs. Yes, that is correct. Israel has a lot of Israeli Arabs living inside its borders. These aren't Palestinians. Some of them may claim affinity with the Palestinian cause. They may identify themselves as Palestinians, but most of them call themselves Israeli Arabs. They enjoy all the rights as the other Israeli citizens do. They can hold government positions. In fact, 20% of the Knesset, which is the Israeli version of a Congress, 20% of the Knesset is Israeli Arab. And in fact, there was recently a Chief Justice of the Israeli Supreme Court that was an Israeli Arab. So they're well integrated into the Israeli society. I heard one person once suggest that in the same way that African Americans in this country experience some sort of prejudice by the majority, that's the same for the Palestinians living in Israel. So they have some racial tension for sure, but they are citizens that enjoy the full protection of the law. Now, as you would imagine, most Israeli Jews are adherents of Judaism. They believe in the Jewish faith, but that's not true of everyone. A lot of Jews living in Israel claim to be atheists. Some of them are Buddhists. Some of them are Christian. Some of them are other religions. You don't have to be a participant in Judaism to be a Jew. Although, if you try to get in Israel and you are Jewish by ethnicity and you claim to be a Christian, you may have quite a hard time. That's not true of any other combination of Jewish ethnicity and religion, just of Christians. And that probably reflects the long, contentious history between Christians and Jews throughout the centuries, which has nearly completely dissipated now. It doesn't exist anymore. There are also Israeli Arabs that serve in the Israeli Defense Forces, surprisingly enough. So they end up fighting Palestinians when it becomes necessary, hunting down terrorists. So a lot of them don't, because they still feel an ethnic affinity with the Palestinians, or they feel as outsiders from Israeli Jews. But some of them do. There's also about a 2% Christian population in Israel, and those are Israeli Christians, Jewish Christians, or Palestinian Christians. Both ethnicities have Christian populations. Now, given that reality, I want to talk about the groups and nations which are extremely hostile to Israel in the region around Israel. And number one on that list is Iran. Iran has, since the 1979 Islamic Revolution, declared that they do not recognize Israel as a state, and they wish to, quote, wipe Israel off the map. And they have spent considerable effort and funding in coming up with ways to sabotage Israel, to initiate fighting against Israel, funding terrorist organizations. And the number one terrorist organization that they fund is the government of Lebanon, which is just to the north of Israel. Now, Lebanon is headed by a man named Hassan Nasrallah, and he's basically a general in the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, if you can believe that. He's paid a salary. He meets with other generals when they get together, and he's basically just another general in the Iranian regime. He claims to have about 150,000 rockets and pointed at Israel, most of them coming from Iran. And in fact, Israel believes that is a true number. 150,000 rockets, nearly all of them capable of hitting any city in Israel at any time. That's a hard way to live. And those missiles have increased greatly since 2006, when Lebanon and Israel were in a conflict. And at that time, Israel was the recipient of many rockets coming from Lebanon. It was a scary time for folks. Though surprisingly, no one was killed. The rockets hit in places where no one was, including mostly not even on buildings, just in open spaces. Syria, which borders Lebanon, is also extremely hostile to Israel, whose name is Bashar al-Assad. Perhaps you've heard him in the news. He's a little bit preoccupied now with the Syrian civil war, but his country has become a major area through which Iran can ship people, weapons, and even money sometimes by way of land from Iran through Syria into Lebanon, where Lebanon is planning an offensive, we believe. Iraq is also hostile to Israel, though they are still in rebuilding mode and can't really mount any defense or attacks on Israel if they wanted to. And Qatar, which is a very teeny tiny country on the Arabian Peninsula, right next to Saudi Arabia. Now, Qatar enjoys the highest standard of living of any nation in the world. The average citizen there makes about $150,000 equivalent, if you can believe that. And they like to spend their money on funding terrorist groups that want to attack Israel. Now, extremely close to Israel are the Palestinian Authority on its eastern front in the territories, what's called the occupied territories, and Hamas, which lives in the Gaza Strip. And both of these are hostile to Israel. The Palestinian Authority has an arrangement with Israel where they have joint security in a number of areas in the occupied territories. So they do try to catch terrorists together, because the terrorists also threaten the Palestinian Authority leaders and their grip on power. And they don't like to see that dissipated or broken. And Hamas, well, they're just extremely hostile. They are a wing of the Muslim Brotherhood, and they have friends as well. For a long time, their major friend was Iran. Yes, Iran again. And then for a number of years, it seemed they had a broken relationship, but now Hamas and Iran are friends once again. And they receive funding and weapons when they can from Iran. Two other countries on Israel's border that are not hostile to it are Egypt, which formed a peace treaty with Israel in 1979. That was a big deal. And the leader of Egypt at the time that initiated this peace treaty was in fact assassinated for his deeds. And the Kingdom of Jordan, which is directly to the east of Israel, it's a kingdom run by a king, obviously, and it had a peace treaty negotiated with Israel in 1994. And both of these nations are not hostile to Israel. Saudi Arabia is an interesting case. It's just to the south and the east of Israel. And for the longest time, it was one of the nations extremely hostile to Israel. But recently, they have a new ruler. His name's bin Salman. And he is about 35 years old. And he wants to bring a new atmosphere, a new culture to Saudi Arabia without completely uprooting all of the citizens and without relinquishing his power. But part of the changes he hopes to bring are the better relations with Israel, especially economically and even militarily in some sense. Now, why is that? Why would Saudi Arabia want to have a working relationship with Israel militarily? Well, it's because they share a common enemy. And that enemy is, yes, once again, Iran. Iran is mostly Shiite. Saudi Arabia is mostly Sunni. And they both vie for control, dominance in the Middle East. and the surrounding areas. Iran is not technically in the Middle East, but it wants to dominate the Muslim world, and so does Saudi Arabia, because that's where, in Saudi Arabia is where Mecca is, and you might have seen a lot of pictures of people going to Mecca and the big cube that everybody's circling around. That's in Saudi Arabia. So Saudi Arabia believes it has a special place in the Muslim world, and probably rightly so. And in order to keep its power, it joins with Israel in resisting Iran's attempts to gain power. Now, there are other groups in the region who are hostile to Israel. I've already mentioned one of them, and that's the Muslim Brotherhood. There are also various jihadi groups. These are terrorist organizations that don't belong to a nation state, but they organize themselves as kind of roaming armies that try to attack enemies of Islam wherever they can. So there are a number of jihadi groups that attempt to attack Israel all the time. There are also hostile nations to Israel around the world, believe it or not. And I'm just going to read you a few of them now. Cuba, Bolivia in South America, Libya in North Africa, Algeria in North Africa, Venezuela in South America, North Korea, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Malaysia, and Indonesia. Now, what do all these groups have in common? Well, they're either communist or socialist, or they're Islamic. So both of those groups, communists and socialists, tend to have a very difficult relationship with Israel. And China also keeps its distance every now and then with Israel. Sometimes it forges some economic ties, but communists and most of the Muslim world are not friends of Israel. Most leftist groups in the world are hostile to Israel. Now, that's generally not true of the left in the United States government, which still supports Israel pretty strongly. But it is true of most leftist groups around the world. Most Western universities and colleges are hostile to Israel. If you were to look on the internet, you could find all sorts of statements by academic societies or certain schools or departments in certain colleges and universities that denounce Israel and denounce Israel's practices. They never talk about Palestinian atrocities or anything like that. They're just simply anti-Israel, and they foment their students to be anti-Israel as well. I've seen this firsthand. The global boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, which was started by some young Palestinians or other Muslims, and that group's whole purpose is to get governments around the world or corporations around the world to either stop selling to Israel or to impose sanctions on Israel until the group gets its way with Israel. Now, this group it's been documented that their reason for existence is also to wipe Israel off the map. But here's the way they phrase it. They say, from the Jordan River, which is the boundary of Israel on the east, to the sea, Palestine will be free. This is their chant. Have you ever seen a BDS movement operating in a protest? This is their chant. From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. And that means getting rid of what they call the Zionist occupiers. And that means all the Israeli Jews that live there. Israeli Palestinians, no problem. They can stay. They were there before. At least most of them were. But the Israeli Jews have got to go. So BDS is a deeply anti-Semitic group. And I'm sorry to say that I was a member of a church that was deeply active in the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. And I'm pretty glad that I'm no longer part of that church. But the pastor is actually a leader in his denomination of the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. So that's pretty sad. As you can see, Israel has more than one enemy in the world. And all of the enemies I just named are working around the clock to sabotage Israel. They're working to fund terrorist organizations who will work on their behalf to attack Israel. They are giving supplies, aid, and comfort to people who are looking to attack Israel. And who is the friend of Israel in the world? If Israel went to war with any of these groups, if Israel was attacked and invaded, who would come to help them? One nation, and that's the United States. The United States is the longest ally of Israel and the one that is definitely most likely to come to Israel's aid if it's attacked. In fact, that is probably why it is not attacked more than it has been. So that's something to keep in mind. When people complain about the United States support for Israel, remember this: they're the only support in the world that Israel has. The other group that I haven't mentioned yet that's extremely hostile to Israel is the United Nations. Now you think, wow, if the United Nations opposes Israel, Israel must be really bad. What in fact you have is a group of small Muslim nations that have taken over certain committees, like the Human Rights Committee, or other committees that can have influence over Israel. They've taken over these committees and they consistently vote to denounce Israel whenever they get the chance. They consistently vote to sabotage Israel through United Nations resolutions. And there is a standing item on many of these committees' agendas, which is to constantly denounce Israel as a nation. It's the only nation that has a standing item on the agendas of these meetings in the UN, of these groups in the UN. It's an appalling reality. But that is why the UN is generally so opposed to Israel. No other nation receives the kind of hate that Israel gets from the United Nations. It's just completely focused on Israel. It's a ridiculous amount of focus, and it really should end. And our most recent UN ambassador, Nikki Haley, was very, very good about denouncing the practices of the United Nations as they attack Israel consistently. And here's a little snippet of that.
Were you surprised what you saw about the attitudes and discussions on the Middle East at the UN, and what could be done to change it?
You know, I was confused. It was totally bizarre because in my first month, talking about the Middle East, there's a lot to talk about. And whether you're talking about Hezbollah or ISIS, all the issues in Syria, which is, a problem, that's what I expected us to talk about. I didn't expect an Israel bashing session. And literally listening to each member say the same thing over and over again, I knew they said it was bad, but until you hear it and you see it, you just can't comprehend how ridiculous it is.
So as you can see, the conflict is never just about Israeli Jews against Arab Palestinians. It's a global conflict. Nations use Israel for their purposes. They use denouncing of Israel to tell the rest of the world which side of the right and left that they belong to. In fact, one of the first things the president of Bolivia did when he was elected a number of years ago was to denounce Israel and kick all the Israeli diplomats out of the country. Apparently, he didn't have anything better to do. It's a way to signal to your friends on the left that you're with them, that you oppose the same enemies they do. Israel is used as a foil more than any other country in the world to declare your political affiliation. Christians often around the world declare their affinity for Israel by supporting Israel in public pronouncements and in non-governmental organizations. They're called Christian Zionists, and they're from every nation on the world. But both the Christian Zionists and other Christians and other supporters of Israel, even if they're not Christian, and the enemies of Israel constantly use this conflict to their advantage. They are funding both sides of the conflict, constantly putting money into it. And who suffers the most? The Israelis and the Palestinians. It's no wonder there's no peace. Everyone is using this conflict to play political games, sick political games, and to keep going murder and bloodshed. Now going on 70 years since Israel's founding in 1948. Thanks for listening. This is the Red Pill Show.